Young and the Restless spoilers shock. Title: The Fall of Kyle Abbott. Kyle Abbott leaned back in the leather chair of his office at Glissade, basking in the glow of his recent success. Becoming CEO of the company had felt like a dream, a victory hard-won after aligning himself with Victor Newman to triumph over his own father, Jack. He had believed this was his moment, the culmination of his talent and ambition, finally being rewarded. For the first time in his life, Kyle felt like he was no longer in anyone's shadow. He was his own man, leading a prestigious company, making decisions that mattered. But success, as Kyle was about to learn, could be fleeting. It had been an ordinary day, or so Kyle thought. His morning was spent reviewing reports, meeting with key executives, and enjoying the sense of control that came with sitting at the helm of Glissade. The company was doing well under his leadership, and Kyle had every reason to believe that his position was secure. After all, hadn't he helped Victor defeat Jack? Wasn't his loyalty and hard work enough to guarantee his place? That illusion shattered the moment there was a knock on the door. Kyle frowned as he glanced up from his desk. It wasn't time for his next meeting, and the persistent knocking felt out of place in the usually calm atmosphere of the office. He rose from his chair and crossed the room to the door, expecting to see an assistant or one of his department heads. But when he opened the door, the sight before him made his stomach drop. Standing there was Nate Hastings, a smirk plastered across his face, and next to him, a figure that sent a chill down Kyle's spine, Tucker McCall. Kyle's brow furrowed in confusion. He hadn't spoken to Tucker in months, and his sudden appearance at Glissade made no sense. Tucker wasn't supposed to be involved with the company in any capacity, or at least that's what Kyle had thought. Before Kyle could get a word out, Tucker thrust a document into his hands, his expression cold and unreadable. "What's this?" Kyle asked, trying to keep his voice steady as he unfolded the paper. "Your termination," Tucker replied calmly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "As of today, you're no longer the CEO of Glissade." Kyle's eyes scanned the document, his heart pounding as the words blurred together. Termination. Effective immediately. No further involvement with Glissade. It felt like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. How could this be? He had worked so hard to secure his position. He had played the game, aligning himself with Victor to outmaneuver Jack. This wasn't how things were supposed to end. Kyle's eyes flicked from the paper to Tucker, then to Nate, who was practically glowing with satisfaction. "This must be a mistake," Kyle stammered, his voice faltering. "Victor, he'll sort this out." Nate chuckled, stepping forward with a mocking grin. "Victor doesn't control Glissade, Kyle. He only owns a small fraction of the company. Tucker here is the real power behind it all. He's been the silent investor all along, and now he's taking control. So no, Victor can't help you." Kyle felt the floor fall out from under him. Tucker? The silent investor? It all clicked into place now. Why Tucker had always been around the edges of the business world, but never quite revealing his hand. Tucker had been the one pulling the strings, and now he was making his move, leaving Kyle in the dust. Kyle's mind scrambled for solutions. He reached for his phone, dialing Victor's number with trembling fingers. The call rang several times before the familiar, deep voice answered. "Victor, it's Kyle," he said, struggling to keep the panic out of his voice. "I've just been handed a termination notice. Tucker's here. He says he's the real power behind Glissade, and I'm out as CEO." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Kyle could almost hear Victor's mind working through the situation, calculating, strategizing. But when Victor spoke, his words offered no comfort. "Kyle," Victor began, his tone measured, "I don't control enough of Glissade to fight this. I wasn't aware Tucker was the one behind it, but if he's the majority stakeholder, there's nothing I can do right now. I'll look into it, but for the time being, you're on your own." Kyle's heart sank. If Victor Newman, the man who always seemed to have a plan, no matter how impossible the situation, couldn't help him, then there truly was no way out of this. "Good luck, Kyle," Victor added before the call disconnected. The phone slipped from Kyle's hand, hitting the floor with a soft thud. For a moment he stood there, numb, staring blankly at the termination notice in his hand. His reign as CEO was over, just like that. Tucker, with his mysterious and far-reaching influence, had swept in and ripped it all away in an instant. Nate's voice broke the silence, laced with amusement. "Looks like your little victory was short-lived, huh? Thought you'd be sitting pretty at Glissade forever, didn't you?" Kyle's jaw tightened, rage bubbling up beneath the surface. But there was nothing he could do. Nate and Tucker had the upper hand, and they knew it. Nate's gloating only made the humiliation worse. Kyle had thought he was untouchable, but now he saw the truth. He had been a pawn in a game he didn't even understand. Tucker, who had remained silent for most of the exchange, finally spoke again. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "This isn't personal, Kyle. It's business. Glissade needs a different direction, and frankly, you're not the man to lead it. I've made my decision." Kyle's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. Losing his temper wouldn't help now. He needed to regroup, to figure out what his next move would be. But as Tucker and Nate turned to leave, the reality of his situation hit him with full force. He was out, defeated, alone. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving Kyle standing in the middle of the office that was no longer his. The silence was deafening. For a moment, he simply stood there. He was staring at the desk where he had made so many decisions, where he had felt so powerful. It seemed absurd now, how quickly things could change, how fragile that sense of power really was. Kyle sank into the chair behind the desk, his mind racing. Tucker McCall was now in control, and with Nate by his side, they had wrested Glissade from him in one swift move. But the question still gnawed at Kyle. What was Tucker's next step? Who would he install as CEO of Glissade? Was Nate just a pawn like he had been, or was he Tucker's chosen successor? Kyle's phone buzzed with a message. It was from one of his old colleagues, already hearing the news of his dismissal. "What's next for you?" the message read. Kyle stared at the screen, the question hanging in the air. What was next for him?